Okay, hi there, everybody. This is the week 2 video for Biochem 1. I'm going to try to make this a weekly tradition of sorts, just to make around a 30-minute video, give or take, that goes over all of the material for the week and makes it possible for you to pause and stop and start and slow down and speed me up. And, I also encourage you to ask me questions in class. Any of the stuff that we don't specifically talk about, ask me about it. As you saw in week 1, there was definitely application of this material in the pre-lab assignments. And again, I don't expect you to perfectly get it from the video and then perfectly spit it back there and then forget it. This is all about building vocabulary over time together. Okay, so with that said, let's jump in. And last week, of course, we were focused on water and its emergent properties as a way of learning and reviewing and learning some new chemistry information. Okay, this week, we're going to build off of that. And first of all, and we should have a little bit of time this week to talk about these concepts in class, we need to understand hydrophilic versus hydrophobic molecules. Okay, these are describing molecules other than water. Let me make sure you're clear that when I say molecule, I mean it's more than one atom put together into some larger arrangement. So you can see a couple of examples of molecules. Here's a simple amino acid, the bottom left of this slide. That would be a molecule. It's got carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and then this variable component that's labeled R. Okay, so generally speaking, right, amino acids, many of them, are good at interacting with water. And the key reason why, you'll be familiar with this from our week 1 material, is that they have a partially negative O and a partially positive H that can interact with the partially positive H and partially negative O of a water molecule. So partial positive there, partial negative there, and you could expect hydrogen bonds to form so that this amino acid will interact with and mix with and dissolve in water. We therefore say it loves water, it interacts with water, okay? Any compound that has, remember we call the bond in water between the O and the H, we call it a covalent bond because together electrons are being shared. Co means together, valent refers to the electrons at the outer edge of the atom. Polar means the sharing is not even, so oxygen wins in that sharing. So any molecule that has that kind of a setup is going to end up with partial positives and partial negatives, and therefore going to be able to mix with water. Also, anything ionic, so such as sodium, Na+, chloride, Cl-. Sorry for the connection there. Maybe I should draw that a little bit better. And that way you can be clear that it is a C and an L, okay? So sodium, which is positive, and chloride, which is negative in their ionic forms. Because they have charges, they will mix with water, as we saw last week. The Na+ will interact with this partial negative O in water, right here. And the Cl- will interact with the partial positive H's in water. Okay, so it's all about if you are partially charged or fully charged, you'll be able to mix in with water, and we call you hydrophilic. And another way to say that is H2O loving, but a more common way to say that is water soluble. Water soluble means it dissolves in water. The opposite of this is hydrophobic. You're probably familiar with the word phobia. If you have a phobia, you have a fear of something. Water does not mix well with uncharged molecules. So here's an example of testosterone down here in the bottom right. This molecule is all carbons and hydrogens. It does have one little OH here, which can get a little confusing, but overall there are so many carbons and hydrogens throughout this molecule that it essentially cannot mix with water. The reason is that when carbon and hydrogen share electrons, they don't share them unevenly. They share them evenly. The H and the C both pull equally hard on the electrons, and neither one wins the tug of war. So neither one becomes partial positive, neither one becomes partial negative. Instead, we have an uncharged molecule. And when it's in water, it therefore just doesn't interact with water. Water wants to interact with itself because of hydrogen bonding. So it will do that. And that means that any oil that's around, for example, or any testosterone that's around, will simply shuffle through all the water molecules until it either floats if it's less dense than the water, or sinks to the bottom if it's more dense than water, and stays separate from it. And again, that's because the water molecules will tend to interact with each other in favor of interacting with each other, rather than interacting with something that is nonpolar. So we would refer to this as a nonpolar substance. We could call it hydrophobic. We also often call these things fat soluble, to note that they are soluble not in water, but in nonpolar compounds like fats. That's important in biology because if something is fat soluble, it has implications in your body. And I'll leave it there for now. There's a lot more I could say there, but I don't want to overwhelm. Okay, so I'm going to clear these drawings and head on to the next slide. Here's maybe an example with some structures that are easier to look at. Of on the left, well, you fill it in. Is that hydrophilic or hydrophobic? And on the right, is that hydrophilic or hydrophobic? They're opposites. I hope you're going with the motor oil is hydrophobic because it has only carbons and hydrogens. They share electrons evenly. Of course, when carbon gets into a tug of war with another carbon, they're exactly the same. So all of these are nonpolar bonds, which means that they're even sharing of electrons. No partial positives, no partial negatives on motor oil. It does not interact with water well. It simply floats to the surface and makes that nice little rainbow slick that you'll see on a puddle that has motor oil in it. On the other hand, glucose has a whole ton of O's sharing electrons with H's, and we are now getting very used to this. See how the first few times it's like, what the heck? And then eventually it's like, yeah, I got it, dude. Stop drawing the stupid arrow with the line and the little Greek delta thingies. That's how learning works, right? We keep seeing this until we feel confident what it is. And more importantly, we know what the implications are. This glucose is so covered in partial positive H's sharing with partial negative O's that it's going to have a really easy time mixing with water and interacting with it, and therefore dissolving in it. Okay, so sugar is water soluble. You know this if you've ever had soda, of course, or like lemonade, or nice sugary drinks of various sorts. And I hope you haven't ever had motor oil, except in your car, although I hope we can get away from that soon too. So a little bit of practice there, and I hope that helps you to make sense of what we're talking about, why these would be hydrophobic on the left and hydrophilic on the right. Okay. Here's what this looks like in practice to give you a little bit of sense of that. Because water is polar, you can see this solute, the green and gray one that is also polar, has a partial negative and a partial positive. And look, the partial positive is interacting through hydrogen bonding with the partial negative oxygen of an H2O. And here the partial negative is interacting with the partial positive hydrogen of an H2O. So these things are dissolving in water as they're surrounded by the water and as they interact with it. Okay, that's what dissolving is. It's an interaction. Same thing over here. Nice. This one's really nicely dissolved. A couple of interactions there, a couple of interactions there. We've got a really nice water-soluble molecule. Now, these ones, meantime, have no partial positives or negatives. So instead, they'll just kind of tend to cluster up into droplets that will either float if they're less dense or sink if they're more dense than water. They don't predictably interact with the water molecules in any way because there's no partial positive to interact with the partial negative O. There's no partial negative to interact with the partial positive H's. So we simply have a gob of, say, oil that forms and then either floats or sinks depending on density. Okay, so again, trying to give plenty of practice with this very important concept. Here's another example with regard to salt, and I mentioned that one earlier. It's just so you can see it. Chloride ions are negatively charged, here shown in green. If you had a crystal of salt, and I made this in class using the exact same colors, so I hope this is resonant for you, it would look like that in 3 dimensions. Right, where the pluses are stuck between minuses and the minuses are stuck between pluses. Here's a plus stuck between minuses, and here's like a minus that's stuck between pluses. There'd be another plus right here. When this crystal gets dumped into water, the individual ions pop off and they interact with water based on their charge. Chloride is negative, it interacts with partial positive H's. This model I don't love because they just show a plus there. It really should be partial plus. You know that. You were already critiquing it in your head. You were saying, ugh, this is amateur hour here. But at any rate, the plus is just to simplify it so they could fit it in that space. They really mean partial positive and partial negative on the oxygen. So again, hopefully this is giving you some examples, some things to think about as to why some things dissolve in water and others don't. It's really all about the chemistry of it, which goes back to how electrons are being shared, which also then goes back to how the periodic table is organized, how we think about that. Okay. Now, the other thing that I'm going to emphasize to you all is we need to learn a little bit about chemical reactions starting this week. And I mentioned this last week. I gave you these examples. This is a slide from last week's video. So here's hydrogen gas, H2, 2 molecules of it. We could write it like, we could write it like this, 2 H2 molecules, or we could draw them out, H2 and H2. Reacting with 1 O2, again, same deal. And making, you can count them up, these 2 H's go with that O, these 2 H's go with that O, we have 2 H2Os that we've made, okay? That's a synthesis reaction. And then on the right-hand side here, we have a combustion reaction, where the methane in the top is reacting with oxygen to make CO2. This is methane here, reacting with oxygen to make CO2 and H2O. That's the burning of natural gas. Or we could talk about the burning of H2 in the presence, this shouldn't be there. I tried to kind of erase it, but it still managed to sneak a little bit in the presence of 1 oxygen. And again, that's the same as the reaction over here on the left. They produce 2 H2Os. Okay. You can also, in reverse, you can have reactions run backwards if you invest energy. In the video last week, I mentioned this to many of you. I accidentally called this hydrolysis, which was just kind of a slip in my brain when I was recording that long video. It's really called electrolysis. You use electricity to split water into H2 and O2. Just wanted to clarify that. But at any rate, these reactions are simply rearrangements of which atom is bonding with which other atom. And chemistry has all kinds of rules over how that looks. We'll get more into those in future meetings. For now, there are 2 types of reactions that I want to briefly introduce you to in the video this week, okay? And just to get you thinking about how these reactions look. They both involve, hey, water, which makes it really kind of nice. It's the first category here, is dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis. These are critical reactions in biological systems, okay? And in them, we call dehydration synthesis by that name because it involves taking 2 molecules. Here, the molecules look like this. They have these yellow rings. We want to link them together to make a larger molecule. This is a way that your body makes proteins. It's a way that your body makes DNA. It links pieces together. It's how your body stores carbohydrates in your muscles, by the way. If you carbo load by eating a lot of spaghetti before a marathon, you're eating spaghetti, which has lots of carbs in it, and then you're going to put them together into these long chains and store them in your muscles so you can run for a long time the next day. So how do you ever put these little pieces together into larger pieces to make an organism? It turns out that if you take a molecule that has an OH on it and find a second molecule that has another OH, you can remove 2 of the H's and 1 of the 2 O's and turn them into water, which of course without needing to memorize a lot of chemistry, that is a stable molecule. That is a workable arrangement of atoms. And this allows you to use the remaining O as a bridge between the 2 molecules to link them together. That's called dehydration synthesis. You'll start to notice O tends to always make 2 bonds. You're going to find that to be generally true in chemistry if you want to start making that note. O tends to bond with 2 other things. And even when you have something like O2, O bonding with itself, you might say, well, that's an exception, right? There's only one bond. Actually, that's why we write this double line. It makes two bonds with the other O by sharing a total of 4 electrons instead of just 2. So O really likes to have 2 bonds, and we'll come back and start elaborating on what numbers of bonds different atoms will make and why. So this is also a workable setup here as a bridge between the molecules. We have O making 2 bonds, which is an electronically stable setting. It's a thing that oxygen likes to do for stability. How can we break this apart? So now you're running the marathon the next day. You need to release some of that, some of those molecules back into your bloodstream to power your muscles, right? Well, you can put water back in. That's what's being shown here. You can stick the H back onto the O and stick the OH in the other spot and reverse the reaction to release these smaller chunks, which can then be processed to make energy in your cells. Okay, so these are very much biologically relevant processes. These are absolutely critical reactions. Again, that doesn't mean therefore pause the video and like go crazy memorizing exactly what this photo looks like. This is your first time seeing it, I would guess. That's great. You're going to see this 1,000 times over. And just like with the partial positive, partial negative, O and H, you see it more and more times, you start to get more and more comfortable and you're like, I know what that is. And then I can add more detail and you can understand biochemistry even better. Okay, so that's the first of 2 reactions, really 2 sets of reactions that I wanted to talk about, dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. The other type of reaction I want to look at is photosynthesis. I assume that you have looked at this before. I do want you to start thinking of this in a deeper way. And this is an equation I think you could come back to in the future many times and just keep understanding it more deeply and better. And you will get huge, huge outcomes in terms of learning, where you start to really make sense of what's going on and why this process is so epic. So you can see the equation. We have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water coming together to make 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. Their formulas are there, and you can see that it's solar energy, light, that is driving the process. I think this might be a better way to look at it, and the reason is that you can actually see the atoms involved. So this is what carbon dioxide looks like down here in the bottom left. It's got a carbon with 2 oxygens on either side. If I draw out the molecular structure, it looks like this. Hey, look, oxygen is making 2 bonds. Cool. And you might even be able to guess that carbon likes to make 4 bonds. Here's water, very familiar to you by now. Glucose, which is a lot more complicated. And oxygen, which again, we drew earlier, looks like that. Okay. Now, what's actually happening in this equation is that electrons coming from water are gaining energy from the sun. And that extra energy is allowing them to stick together into a much more complicated molecule that is the basis of living things. Okay? So I don't need you to memorize a ton of different equations. I really don't need you to memorize any equations per se. You should intimately know eventually the photosynthesis equation because of how much it tells you about biochemistry, about why reactions matter, okay? Rearranging the electrons that are shared between carbon and oxygen in CO2 and between hydrogen and oxygen in water. Rearranging those electrons is an amazing feat. And if you leave carbon dioxide and water sitting on a table, or, you know, like in the air and water around Earth, they're not just going to spontaneously form glucose. Glucose is too complicated. Only a living system, for the most part, can come in and actively put together carbon dioxide and water in a new arrangement of electrons. Remember, the bonds are all electrons being shared. This is an amazing arrangement of electrons and the atoms that they are associated with into a new shape that is glucose and that has all kinds of properties that render it a great basis for living things. Okay, so thinking that through and understanding that that's why chemical reactions matter. They're a rearrangement of who's bonding with whom by rearranging electron sharing, rearranging those covalent bonds. They don't just happen like automatically when we're talking about chemistry of living things, when we're talking about biochemistry. They happen in ways that are very specific and that are driven by processes that have evolved over billions of years. This makes life feel very, very epic, I would think. So I hope that begins to give you like some exposure to why that matters and some review of the photosynthesis equation. I'll conclude each video with some terms to add. Hopefully you've now got a sense of hydrophobic versus hydrophilic. You understand what dehydration synthesis is and how hydrolysis, the opposite process, works. And finally, you've got some exposure to photosynthesis, which is probably fair to argue, certainly one of the top few, if not the top biochemical reaction on Earth for living things. So I hope that this video is informative and gives you some additional information. Again, I encourage you, take notes on this if it helps, rewatch it if it helps, ask me questions, come to student support block, ask me questions. There are no bad questions. I don't expect you all to be experts on this right away. I expect that you might have some things that you're like, I need to know more about this. Great, come and tell me that. Hey, this thing, tell me more. Okay, cool, I can do that. I'm not going to push you, and I'm not trying to like expose what you don't know. I'm trying to add things to what you do know and understand. So I hope that's all helpful. Hope you're feeling good, and I will see you all in class.